I'd like to ask our panelists to join me. Okay. So cyber and the Internet of Things. We've got a tremendous panel here discussion for you. I want to just lay out a little bit the predicate and start with I guess, two concepts. One, everyone here is familiar with the explosion of the Internet of Things. I think we had a significant discussion over the last couple of days, particularly about 5G and how a 5G network will really allow for billions and billions of internet-connected devices. That's some of the promise of a 5G network. And then the question really is, okay, so what happens with all of that data? What happens with all of those devices? So rather than get stuck in a very, very complicated world of billions and billions of devices, I'm going to talk about my toothbrush. So I have an electric toothbrush. It's a wonderful thing. I turn it on. It brushes my teeth. And it is Bluetooth connected to an app on my phone, which actually connects me to the manufacturer of the toothbrush. And that app can tell me how long I'm brushing, which teeth I'm missing, how to change my habits, and it can give me a record of all of the brushing I do every single day. Wonderful. Although, I guess the flip side is whoever is taking that data not only knows how much I'm brushing, they know when I'm brushing, they know where I'm brushing, they know a whole bit about me as a person. Do I really want that to happen? Well, maybe I do, maybe I don't. It's a great toothbrush. I have never activated the app. But I think it's a pretty good way to start thinking about what happens with cybersecurity in a world of billions and billions of devices. So the panel today, as I said, pretty extraordinary. So to my immediate left is Michael Dent. And each of our panelists will give a little more background of themselves, but I'll just do a quick one. Michael is the CISO. No?
Dom.
No, I'm sorry. It's Dom Cussatt.
We switched it up on you.
Yeah, you did. Dom is the Deputy CIO for the Department of Veterans Affairs. Next to Dom is Sean Calfin, who is the CISO for Freddie Mac. Next to Sean is John Wilson, who is the Field CTO for Agari. And finally, Michael Dent, who is the CISO for Fairfax County and who is actually the chair of the CISO group for the National Capital Region around Washington, D.C. So a tremendous group of panelists. I guess I'd open it up and ask each of you to do a quick, kind of more detailed background on yourself, but also answer the following question. And that is, okay, so we have my toothbrush example, but we have billions of those coming online. How do we build trust into this world of Internet of Things connected devices? Anybody want to start? Yes.
Sure, I'll start. Again, I'm Dominic Cussatt, Deputy CIO at Veterans Affairs. Prior to that, I was the CISO there for a couple of years. And then prior to that, I was at the Department of Defense in the CISO's office. I was a deputy CISO there, and I had been there for about 12 years. So, over that stretch of time, I got to see a lot of this space evolve. And, back in 2003, when I joined the Department of Defense, it's interesting because the cybersecurity policy in the department explicitly stated that things like the Internet of Things were called were called platform IT and were explicitly excluded from any information assurance and cybersecurity policy. They had an out. And what the policy basically said was we're going to, on a case-by-case basis, figure out adequate security for those types of things. And that included SCADA systems, any industrial control systems, any of our missiles and weapons systems, chips on bombs, things like that, explicitly excluded from the cyber policy. So when we rewrote the policy in 2013, we knew the world had changed, and it was a big muscle move to rein those in and bring those into the fold for cyber. And it was very controversial because the field was used to that get out of jail free card and being able to figure it out on their own and not deal with the oversight. So just a couple of things on that note. What we did in the department was we reined them in, but we also acknowledged that you don't implement cybersecurity on Internet of Things type stuff the way you do on a customary computing system, a desktop, a network. So we called it as it was, and we started to write implementation procedures and assessment procedures for these types of devices that were specific to how they operated and addressed their specific security needs. So that helped the department sort of get their heads around it. At the VA, as you can imagine, a big thing at the VA is medical devices, and that's exploding. Any of you who go to HIMSS, you see every year this. If you walk the floor, you see this wide array of things that are there available, and our clinicians, our veterans want those things to be used out in the field. So again, have to acknowledge they do have cybersecurity needs, but they're a bit different, and help with guidance and direction for how to implement those things for what they are, and not pretend like they're mini computers, but that they have a specific purpose and a specific need. And I'll just throw in too, one of the things that has helped us a lot at the VA are isolated networks for our medical devices. A couple of years ago, we did a full audit and a discovery of everything we could find in terms of medical devices and IoT for medical out on our networks. And then we did an isolation architecture to kind of pull those off of the main network and put some controls in place to kind of protect them. So, it's two parts, acknowledging what the controls are and the special needs for how to implement them, and then buying yourself some time by isolating some of those architectures so you have a little more time. You mitigate that risk while you get those controls in place and learn.
Yeah, a lot of activity. Sean, you've had a varied background. I know you're going to go into that, including now at Freddie Mac, but previously at Department of Homeland Security. So a little more background on you, please, and then, how do you think we build trust into this expansive world of IoT devices?
Great, thank you, Peter. Good morning, again, Sean Calvin with Freddie Mac, and as we think about, the financial sector is built on trust, and as we think through how do we ensure integrity of transactions, trust that people are putting their money in financial instruments and assets, and how do we ensure that trust life cycle and that trust chain? But I would also draw similar vignettes when coming from Homeland Security, previously served as a CISO there for the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and it's a similar construct where we focused on, our initial focus was on the 70,000 assets that we have in the environment, but what we didn't necessarily consider is as we start connecting all of our sensors, cameras, everything else that we have, whether it's along the border, supporting other mission systems at our points of entry, how do we start to look at the security of these assets, especially as they're starting to be connected, fused into our sectors? And it's the same when we think about when we have an exploit on a traditional IT asset, we might lose, hey, whether it's email, sensitive data, now you potentially have mission at risk. And when we think about IoT, those are our key mission enablers. And prior to coming to CBP, was in the Department of Defense, working with Dom, but on the operational side. And the same construct when we think about our weapon systems, our platform systems. We had the approach where they were just segmented off and let's put them in the corner. It's difficult to update them given hey, it takes 10 years to build a littoral combat ship. And so what you started with when you contract that out, you have to rip and replace by the time that ship lands in the water. And so as we think about that and start integrating architectures and networks, it's similar to what's going on now with the proliferation of IoT, where now you have devices that are executing mission functions that are on the same common network as the rest of our compute devices. And so how do we think about this where we think about the identity mechanism? When I think about the root core of trust in this framework, it has to start with identity. But now when we think about the world of IoT and this explosion of devices, are all IoT devices created equal? I don't think so. I think we need to think through how do we tier this appropriately, as similar to with what the medical FDA does with classifying medical devices. You have your different tiers. If it's a device that doesn't impact life and limb, they don't have as much of a standard or requirements you need to meet. But if it's something that can affect life and limb, there's more stringency around it. And I think as we start to see the interconnection here, we start to work toward the identity of these assets, what's processing, flow of data, can we ensure integrity in the flow of data, whether now integrity, some of the activities we tried even on the border with video cameras, we piloted through our Silicon Valley effort in DHS with trying blockchain on video cameras. Maybe we can't prevent the cartels and adversaries we can't prevent them from maybe interacting if they were working to try to tamper some of these feeds, just given the limited amount of security packages. But if we identify the device, we look at items like blockchain on these video feeds, it's an integrity function. So maybe we can't prevent every single thing, but we can ensure integrity where we know that whether or not somebody did tamper with it. Mm-hmm. And we can develop the right responsive frameworks to approach it. So I think it starts with, it's a tiered sliding scale, in my opinion, and depending on what is the intent and purpose of these devices, and we need to categorize them and think through how do we structure the right controls, identity, and integrity of data.
So Sean, that's terrific, and kind of sets the stage for the industrial strength members of the panel and the serial startup member of the panel. So John, as you think about this question, think of it from a startup standpoint. Think of it from a consumer standpoint. So from a consumer standpoint, as you're trying to develop capability that will help them, how do consumers get confidence that when they start bringing these IoT devices into their home, and they may not even know they're all IoT devices, how do they get confidence and trust that they're not bringing in more problems than they are advantages?
Sure. So John Wilson, Field CTO at Agari. Agari is an email trust company. And before you all laugh, because I think we can all agree that email still seems to be somewhat untrustworthy, we have made a lot of strides. Before January 2012, any cyber criminal could send an email that said it was from PayPal.com, and there was nothing to stop it technically. That all changed in January 2012 with a standard known as DMARC. Now, getting that standard out was very difficult. We had to work with Google and Yahoo, Microsoft, AOL, Comcast, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It took a lot of negotiation. A lot of people had to commit to do this. And it was sort of a mini moonshot, if you will. It was more like, let's maybe do a suborbital flight or whatever. And yet we've been able to do this. Now, has it solved the phishing problem? Well, it has solved a category of the phishing problem. But you still have the challenge of the end user. How many of you, when you get an email, look at the email address versus looking at the name that is displayed? Well, I can still send an email from a random AOL account and just say that I'm PayPal. And a lot of people are going to still fall for that. And this technology, DMARC, does not solve that problem. So the first thing that we really learned was that you have to account for people. Ideally, it should be unobtrusive. It should simply work without them even being aware that it's there. And in the PayPal.com case, yes, indeed, it does work. All of you today, if you use Gmail, Hotmail, Yahoo, AOL, et cetera, for your personal email, you're not going to get a fake message from PayPal.com. And that just happens. You didn't have to do anything. It just happens. So the other thing we learned is that, you've got, people are in many ways your weakest link. They can be subverted. So even if we had, say, a very safe internet where you could do voting, What's to say that somebody's not sitting next to the person with a gun to their head telling them to vote a certain way? So people can be co-opted in some way, or perhaps in a much less violent manner, simply tricked into voting the way an adversary might want them to vote. So that's one issue. The other issue is you're only as strong as your weakest link. And as I look at IoT, you look at things like the Mirai botnet. That was all enabled by the fact that a lot of these systems were put out very quickly at the cheapest cost possible, and they had default passwords that couldn't even be changed. So I think that in order to achieve this moonshot, we're going to have to at least have a system that if your device is going to go onto this superhighway or whatever, the express lane, it has to meet certain minimum requirements. Now, whether that's going to be done through legislation and regulation or done through some other means, that is going to have to happen so that anything that could be dangerous to the system as a whole, much in the same way this army of IoT devices that were co-opted by the Mirai botnet, we have to be in a position where no one flaw can take down the whole system. So that's key. The other thing is privacy. And people need to understand what rights they're giving up or what potential exposure they have when they get a device. And one thing I would almost compare this to is when you go to see an R-rated movie or a PG-13 movie, nowadays they tell you specifically, contains nudity, adult situations, violence, et cetera, and now you can make that decision for yourself. Will I let my children see that film? Well, if it's got a couple of adult situations, maybe. If it's got, gratuitous sex and violence, perhaps not. Each of us can make that decision, and I almost see it as little icons that would be on the package of whatever device you're buying that will, one will represent that you are, this thing can track your location. This thing can listen to what you're saying. This device perhaps can get video of you, and be aware that if you install that device in your home, in your car, at your office, that you in fact do run that particular risk based on the icons that were on the outside of the box. So in other words, dumb it down, make it easy for people to make that decision. Nobody is going to read that 34-page EULA that every one of us clicks through every time Apple or Microsoft wants to upgrade our device. We've got to get beyond that.
That's a great segue into a question, Dominic. It's just kind of a slight variation on this theme. So obviously we're at the CES G conference, and governments have several roles to play in IoT. One is regulation. One is encouraging voluntary compliance, whether it's with a UL or similar type of organization. The other, though, is giving confidence to the population that the government can handle its own IoT devices. So in the capital region in particular, a lot of people focus on that area. I think many people are aware that during the inauguration activities of President Trump, there was a takeover of the video surveillance cameras in the Washington, D.C. area. About 2/3 of the cameras were taken over for days, or at least they were rendered inoperable for days. So how do we get confidence, not only that people can deal with their IoT devices, but that the government can actually manage its own IoT devices?
Mike Dent, Fairfax County, not Dominic. He's down there.
Oh, yeah.
Gotcha.
Sorry. Again,
We confused
the order.
me, though. We'd switched.
The order.
And really quick for me, I chair the National Capital Region CISO Committee, which is the 22 sovereign jurisdictions around D.C. We meet once a month and we talk about all these things. And I'm also now the chair of this cyber working group, which is unique in that we've brought the different emergency support functions throughout the capital region. There's 1 to 2 from each one of those support functions that come to this cyber working group now, where we're starting to talk about how cyber affects their areas. So it's a brand new working group, so we're excited about it. And we've had one meeting, we've had several calls, so I'm excited to see where it goes from there. In regard to your question, for Fairfax County, one, I think it's the citizens of our county who, a lot of you live there. A lot of the citizens. It is an IT-centric county. To me, I think there's an expectation that as their local government, a lot of the services and things they do, they pay their taxes. To me, it's an expectation that we are going to do what we need to do to secure their data. That's my mission. That's my office's mission, is to make sure we conduct business and we conduct it securely, because it's their data that it's ultimately going to affect. So we go to great lengths. We do tons of assessments. We're constantly working to make sure our environment is safe and it's secure. Being where we are in the National Capital Region, we do integrate and we do collaboration with all those jurisdictions, in that, we have an a dark fiber network that we own. Each of us own our own piece of that. We've interconnected them, and we've set certain minimum standards. And for me, going back to IoT across the board, if we don't have manufacturers held accountable, if we don't have leadership of those companies held accountable, if they're deploying products and things to the consumer world, not only to the consumer world, but to the business world. Because you talked about the HIMSS conference. I have police chiefs who go to their conference, and they all come back with IoT. Mm-hmm. And every single one of them tells whoever it is, yep, we're certified to whatever regulation is. Then when we look at it, we know it's not. They have to start all over, or the county is spent funding to buy something that can't go on the enterprise. The moonshots that you've been talking about, the express lane, we've been doing that for our IoT devices, our different pieces of our network. It's all based on business, the line of business, and what they need, and the regulations that govern them. So,
well, Mike, you mentioned ownership, right? Mm-hmm. And so, if I do a Google search, mm-hmm. And Google has my information from that search, they can sell, they can resell, but from a regulatory standpoint, you kind of know Google is doing the vast majority of the search engine work. So you know where to focus your energies as a regulator and what you can demand of them and how they operate. Who knows who made my toothbrush, right? I know, but I'm not going to tell you. But there are a lot of toothbrush manufacturers out there. So it's very quickly a very diverse world of people who actually get that data at the first instance. And so as we think about IoT and we think about what to do with IoT devices and IoT to providers, how do we deal with the fact that there is not 3 or 4 or 5 companies that are going to get this data at a first instance? There are hundreds and thousands of companies that are going to get this data, depending on who manufactured the device. So as you think about regulating IoT, how do we deal with the data issue? Whose data is it? Is it my mouth? Is it the manufacturer of the toothbrush company? Who gets that data, and how do we make sure it doesn't get abused? Anybody?
I would ultimately say it is the individual who has initial control of what goes on, because you either choose to buy that toothbrush and connect it, or you don't. But the manufacturer, I think you can't make that logical choice unless you know some basic things about that device. So, is there encryption involved if your data is being transmitted? I don't know if a toothbrush can handle encryption, but those are the kinds of things, like you were saying, something that's going to identify easily to the consumer or to the business what level. I mean, we talked yesterday a little bit, and I've talked about it before. Having some sort of underwriter's laboratory certification. All these devices in here, the electricity in here, they can't be put up without that certification. We need something in the industry that maybe anybody making these things, they're going to certify to a basic minimum standard that they're going to do those things to.
So in an underwriter's laboratory electrical bulb standpoint, that certification is really about safety.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So I guess the question is, when we talk about that kind of a concept for IoT, is that certification really about privacy and what privacy expectations we can have for companies who sign up with that? Is that a worthy goal that we should be focused on? Anybody?
I mean, absolutely. The two have to go hand in hand. One of the neat things about the internet is that you can be anonymous. This is great for, journalists and dissidents, et cetera, in places perhaps that don't have free speech. But it also means that, people are just savage each other when you post something on social media, for example, because they're hiding behind a fake identity. Or what I deal with on a day-to-day basis are West African criminals who effectively use social engineering to steal from, the elderly, to steal from businesses, et cetera, et cetera. And so, the vision that I would ultimately have, and I think something like 5G might be able to help along this path, is that the data should be mine, ultimately living with me at all times, so that every time somebody wants a bit of data about me, they come to me and I have the opportunity to deny or authorize the request. Now, that seems, how shall we say, very intrusive, if you will, but it might be the sort of thing that, okay, your toothbrush wants to send your location to so-and-so, and maybe I can say, that's all right if I'm in my home, but if I've left the boundary of my home, I don't want that information out there. So giving people those fine-grained controls over it, I think is crucial. Now, not everybody's gonna make the right decisions there, but at least if we have the control, we have the opportunity to limit the damage. The other thing that I think could be really helpful here is if data could be done in a way that the data itself is encrypted, that it can only be used for the purpose it was meant to be used for. That even if somebody copies that data, steals it from a company, because it was encrypted from day one from me going out to, say, the toothbrush company, if somebody gets at the toothbrush company's database, what they have is then useless on me. They would have to ask me again for that data in a way that they can read it, and I'm going to deny the request because they're not the toothbrush company.
I think adding to that is where, that's, as you mentioned, the benefit of 5G. That's where right now we are constrained when we think about bandwidth, what controls, what we can, encryption, what we can put on the communication and connection with these devices. And with the promise of 5G, if we can start putting better packages on some of these devices, we can ensure encryption without impacting performance and the operation of whether it's our communicating with some of our assets, using it for decision making, mission systems or weapon systems, whatever the case may be. We can start to. It provides a platform to achieve some of these security considerations, and then you still have the challenge on the points. How is the data managed? How is it used? When we think about some of these IoT, it's not like where we have a refresh every 3 to 4 years with our life cycle. How many? When we think about a refrigerator, do we expect these companies now to support a refrigerator for 20 years? How long do we keep our refrigerator, our fridges? And so, how do we think about this in a way exactly where we protect it up front, and whether we think about how data is stored and managed, and to ensure that this polarity that we're dealing with, the maintenance long-term, the maintenance of these devices, and what's that data aggregation threat and concern that we're thinking of.
So Sean, as we go beyond toothbrushes to refrigerators and we get to 10, 15, 20-year life devices, one of the questions becomes, what about upgradable IoT? What about firmware that can be changed over time? What about the need for passwords? So as we think about this UL concept of what requirements would be necessary to get kind of a stamp of approval that people can rely on, where does encryption, where does passwords, where does upgradability fit in to these devices? Does it depend on whether it's a disposable device, like a toothbrush that I'm going to have for 15 years? Well, maybe if I change the brush. Or do you need a different standard for long live devices?
Yeah, I think it's a bit subjective and it's a bit case by case. To Mike's point, when you're a consumer and you decide to use an item that's an IoT item and collects your data and shares it, the example I use is my thermostat in my house. I can control it from my phone. From here in Las Vegas, I can turn my heat off and freak my family out. But that thing is set up so that my HVAC contractor that maintains my system can, if something's happening, they can tap into my thermostat and see what kind of codes are being thrown by the device. So, when you look at using a device like that as a consumer, you make a risk decision. Is the data that this thing's going to collect worth the services that I'm going to get for it? It's going to make my life richer. I'm willing to take that risk to leave some of that data out. So the same is true for IoT. You don't treat everything equal. You have to do a risk assessment and determine, okay, for the data that thing's going to carry or transmit, is it worth the services that is going to provide for me? So, and then to your question, you then have to add another layer to that and think long term. What are the services that IoT device is providing to me? Are they critical services? Are they kind of nice to have, need to have? What are they? And what kind of data is traversing it? And how is that interacting with my network? So there are some devices that maybe they're throwaway devices, and you won't care if they, their firmware can be updated or their operating system can be updated. But there are things that do need that. Another example I use is my son was, at the time he was about 7 years old, and he was in the hospital for a procedure, and he had to go under general anesthesia. And we got to his hospital room, and his vital sign monitor that was sitting next to him had the blue screen of death on it. And it said, right across the bottom, Windows has encountered an error and will shut down. And I'm like, all right, this is happening. And the nurse just kind of looked at it and went, oh, okay, I'll go get another one. And she went out and she got another device. So those things are also hooked to the network. They go back to the nurses' stations. They keep track of what's going on with the patient. That's pretty important. And so I would insist as either a consumer or a federal government consumer, that vendor needs to make sure that thing is upgradable. And that really has to be a partnership. The government has to work very closely with industry, let the industry know what our needs are and what our expectations are. But it's not something you can make a blanket statement.
So let's go from toothbrushes to refrigerators to the mother of all IoT devices, automobiles. So we've talked about 5G, and we've talked about the ubiquity of 5G, what it does, Sean, to reduce latency. And obviously, as we think about self-driving automobiles, 5G is going to have an enormous impact on the ability of automobiles to be able to communicate. But let's combine two technologies now. So we live in a world where the 5G networks have rolled out. We live in a world where automobiles are increasingly getting self-driving kind of capabilities. How does blockchain now fit into the equation? So the financial services world is one of the leading industries in kind of adding blockchain to safeguard transactions. How does blockchain work in an IoT world with self-driving automobiles? What are the advantages and disadvantages? How ought it to be used? Any thoughts on that?
So I'll take the first stab. When I think about the promises of blockchain, I think in certain cases it's been overhyped in a few areas, but it primarily comes down to an integrity function. And I look at this where, and for the financial services, we've embraced it first because we don't want to be disrupted, right? Mm-hmm. You start to see the surge in cryptocurrencies and using the blockchain technology. If you no longer have to go through a middleman to conduct a trusted transaction, that starts to really eat at the core of the financial services sector. And so they've taken a large step forward to get a lot of these, the big, your JP Morgans, Citibanks, et cetera, to get together to see how do we ensure, still drive that trust, improve how we do transactions, but then we can start looking at deviation from those transactions. So from a fraud perspective, when we think about movement of payments, securitization of assets. How do we ensure we have that level of integrity? And you're not able to prevent it with the blockchain. You're complementing that with other technologies. But at least it starts to, we know when something does go wrong and we can address it. And it's the same thing if we've taken the healthcare vignette where, hey, you start using a blockchain and a ledger for your healthcare records, and now if you are in an accident somewhere else across the country, they know exactly, if they have the right access, they can see what they can treat you appropriately to see if you're allergic to anything they need to be concerned about, and they still have that, and it's on that ledger, and you have a record of it. So that's where we see the promise And especially as we switch to, think about autonomous vehicles and cars, how do we, as we build out this network, how do we ensure that there's there's a decision framework of how these vehicles interact and communicate, and how do we ensure that the decisions that are being made are securely conveyed to the vehicle, back to the network, to the 5G tower, and how do we start to lay the foundation for that as we expand this across the country?
So, Michael, how will local government deal with this? So, how do you deal with the onslaught of 5G networks and autonomous vehicles in Fairfax County, and who's responsible for making sure this is all going to work out?
Well, currently we actually have a smart city initiative, which it's unique for Fairfax is because we're not a city. We are a county. We don't own any of our smart technology, the streets, the street lights. We have some. I want to say for us, most of it is it's controlled by the business, the line of business. There is no central piece that we're doing to manage it. Across the National Capital Region, I can tell you for blockchain, there's none of us really looking at it right now. To us, it's still too new. And one, I can't hire skill set to come in and help us build it. So what I'm going to start looking at for us future-wise is I'm going to look at the vendors and the people I'm looking at to help us with our business applications. And you come to me with blockchain built in. That's going to help us get to it a little bit faster because, the funding and things to get in and invest in it, it's very tight right now for us to try and do that. So I would look at vendors and I would tell you, come to us with it built in or some form that we can start down that road. Because right now, we're still just trying to defend the networks, doing the things that we do. But blockchain still, for us, is still too new.
So cyber and IoT devices, we started with toothbrushes, we got to refrigerators, we've now gone to cars. We would get to trains, but we have a speaker on trains later in the day. So we've gone as far as we can go. What about you folks? So questions to the, yes, sir. Can you stand just so we can all hear you? Thanks.
I can't see.
My hypothesis is that none of the individual devices really matter that much if they compromise or they fail or something happens. My big concern is the network effect of many devices. What are your thoughts on that aspect?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I hate to be Mr. Doom and Gloom here, but I mean, an obvious risk. Once you have enough connected thermostats, light bulbs, et cetera, hottest day of the summer in an area that is known, like, for example, the Bay Area, we always get a couple weeks during the summer where it gets so hot that, they encourage people, if you can avoid, running extra stuff, run your washing machine and dryer at night, please, et cetera. Try to reduce the electricity usage. Now, a foreign adversary could black out the entire Bay Area simply by commanding every one of those devices to turn on every light, turn the heat up to whatever, and now suddenly you've got actual, potentially, life-threatening things happening. If you've got somebody that, is on some sort of life support system, and there's only so many hours of battery at the hospital, this is a problem. So that's the doomsday scenario. And I think this is really why there needs to be a way in which, in order to get onto this sort of safe network, if you will, or this safe express lane, you're going to have to meet certain requirements. And one of those requirements is going to have to be that the manufacturer can, like that, shut it down if it needs to be shut down or update it if it needs to be updated. I also think that what we're going to see is there's almost going to be these little bots running around on that network, if you will, that are like the traffic cops on that express lane. And they're going to be looking for anomalous traffic. And it's going to, of course, be very AI-based. And they're going to say, wait a minute, what the hell is going on? Why is suddenly every light bulb in the Bay Area being commanded to come on? This doesn't make sense. We've never seen that pattern before. And therefore, raise the alarm somewhere so somebody can deal with that immediately.
Next question. And we've got lights in our eyes, so if you want to just wave, we'll hear you. Yes, please.
So you guys have talked a lot about how there's a convergence of privacy and cybersecurity in our industry. And a lot of people are starting to impose constraints on how that information is collected. Talk more about
Okay, Sean?
That's a great question, and that's where in my view, we have to. We can't take. This is not a one-size-fits-all approach. It should be. We need to think through as we have certain fit and purpose in a sense with some of our devices, where if it's something that is, whether it's life and limb, whether it's something personal, I think we need to think through how do we tier that a little bit more appropriately, but how do you still enable the development, the R&D for maybe other devices that aren't as critical. And so I think that's where we have to find that. It's a polarity I think we're going to continue to struggle with, whether it's as we work to achieve the cyber moonshot and as we deal with the new development of these new technologies over the next 3-5 years. It's a case of polarity management, but I think we need to tier this appropriately, and that's where we can still enable the R&D research to drive innovation, but without impacting personal data, life and limb devices, and it's thinking through what does that construct look like as we move forward.
And so, it very much gets back to the fundamental question of confidence, right? If you have confidence in the security of these devices or their inability to do you significant harm, then you're, more than willing to allow them to flourish because you can get benefit from it. But if you have a crisis of confidence in them, then the question becomes you're going to run around trying to shut down all of the light bulbs in your house. And that's going to cause a lot of disruption once those light bulbs have already been enabled. So it's really an ongoing issue. We have only a few more minutes left, so I'd ask each of our panelists in order to try to give one last view of if there's one thing we want to take away from the kind of the crashing together, no pun intended, on the cars of cybersecurity and IoT. What should this room be thinking about as to how we solve that puzzle? Dom, starting with you.
Sure. I really look at IoT as what makes our technology at the VA and on our networks come alive to the end user. That's what makes our technology live. It's very tangible. It's out there. It's very tactile. They're holding devices or wearing devices that are giving them data, telling them to do things, improving their lives. So there's really no getting away from it. We need to be able to provide those services to people. But we need to categorize, rack and stack, think about how these things are going to be used, what kind of data is on there. Is it disposable data? Is it permanent data that's very sensitive? And otherwise we become paralyzed by the daunting thought of securing billions of devices. So I really think it's important that we categorize and think about how to chunk this up.
Yep.
Thank you. Sean?
Similar to just opening comments, as we think through the importance of identity of these devices, as we look at it, even within Freddie Mac is exploring even for drones for home appraisals, and how can we use other devices to further enable our business, reduce costs, create efficiency, increase revenue, and the same thing in the mission context, whether it's DHS or DoD. How do we ensure that for some of these devices that are executing critical functions, there's an identity function. We know what we know what these devices are. We know what they're doing and what their purpose is and how they should operate. And we can start to look at deviation from that. Hey, as John mentioned, that deviation, if it shouldn't, the anomalous piece. And as we see 5G, we see the maturation of these devices. Maybe right now we can't put a security package on every single IoT device. So how do we think about it architecturally, where maybe it's you have a device that has a set purpose, and you restrict the input-output, right? You lock it down to, hey, this device performs this one function, and you restrict it to that, and so you don't have any. It's a sort of runtime application self-protection. What we do for legacy software, you drop a jar file and lock it down. You lock the code down, so it can't do anything else other than its intended function. And then you have trust. you have assurance of execution, and then you start to look at where that data is flowing to and how do you ensure you're protecting it appropriately, depending on what the function of those devices are. I think those are the key foundational elements for as we move forward in this environment, which is we're going to hit fast forward with quantum computing. I know we didn't dive into that, but we're going to hit the fast forward button as we're operating in an environment of exponentials that we're going to see it get a lot scarier before it gets better.
So John, as the startup guy on the panel, are you concerned that you're hearing too much regulation that's going to stifle innovation as we think about IoT devices, or is it necessary?
Well, to bring it to market, I think you are going to need some regulation. Just like, for example, a new drug. A company can certainly, work in a lab, come up with a new chemical, inject it into rats or whatever, and see if it kills rats. But eventually, they've got to go through some steps to bring that drug to market. And I think in much the same way, you can innovate all you want in your own environment, even, cars, planes, et cetera. They don't roll the plane out the very first time, when the paint's still damp, load it up with, 500 passengers and try to fly it to Hong Kong. That's not the way it works. It makes a few test flights, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that innovation will not be stifled by this, but I do think there will be a few last steps, if you will, before a device can go from, hey, we invented this really cool thing. Now we do have a couple of small hurdles to jump through before we can put it on this express lane.
Thank you. Michael, you got the last word.
Do you see how many cars they crash before they actually go to market? I mean,
Exactly.
Why can't we do that with IoT?
Exactly.
There needs to be more, to me, there needs to be standards. I hate to say the regulation word, but there has to be something out there. For me as a business in government, I need that because all of our businesses, they go out and they see it and they try to bring it in. And one device can cripple an enterprise. We build defense in depth, but with the unknowns, and if we don't know what's been tested or how it's being assured to us that it is secure or that it's not, chock full of back doors and things like that, we have to have some kind of check off with that. So for me, I think, and standards, some sort of regulation, and we need accountability. And the accountability is from the consumer, the business, and the manufacturer of these devices.
So with that, I want to thank our panelists. I hope this has been a useful discussion for everyone. I do want to leave one final note, a little bit like the quantum computing discussion that we've had over the past couple of days. Once that comes on board, existing encryption becomes endangered. And the question is, how do you retrofit your existing encryption capability? Well, we already have a few billion IoT devices out there now. There will be 25 billion IoT devices within the next 10 years, but they're already out there. So when we talk about what needs we have for an underwriter laboratory or a regulatory framework, we've already got all of these devices out there that are not going to get shut off, and they don't have any of that protection. So how do we deal with that? So with that, I want to again thank our panelists, and I want to thank you for participating in this breakout session.